rabbiting on a little bit longer, it's delightful from a personal point of view to reconnect with friends and former students of mine, including some, I have to say, who go back more than 50 years. That's quite a joy, and tells something about the idea of community. And you know that Jill and I this year have tried to make the theme one of community, connecting and coming together. This morning we're going to hear from a very special member of our community who, like many of us, went away and came back. There's something about this island, but let's leave that just for the moment. So welcome to the July meeting of our Friends, Their Stories, the monthly series hosted by the Friends of the QV MAG. To begin, we, the Friends of the QV MAG, acknowledge the first inhabitants of the nation and the traditional custodians of the lands and waters where we live, learn and work. The Letarama Runa people, the Panana people and the Cheranotipana people. We honour their enduring culture and knowledges. Now I hand over to Jill to introduce our speaker.
Morning, everyone. I knew this had happened. It's not COVID. She's got a croaky throat. We first approached Catherine to contribute to the oral history program over a year ago. We knew her career would be of interest and certainly worth recording. After all, the life of a senior public servant is really cloaked in mystery. I think I learnt most of it from Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, but anyway, they work for the people of Australia and are promoted, very, very capable people because of their experience and expertise. Well, in recent years, staffing levels, like in a lot of government departments of the public service, have been cut, and political staffers to some degree have replaced career public servants. So you lose a lot of institutional knowledge, I think. And as we know, they don't often last too long as they rise and fall with their political masters. So to have a highly successful public servant of 22 years as a speaker here is a real treat. And particularly so as Catherine is, of course, from the area and, like Margaret, as an old teacher, as a teacher of a number of years, we sort of look upon the students, ex-students who have done well as part of the family. You know, we take sort of reflected pride for some ridiculous reason in what they've managed to achieve. And Catherine was also a very special student because she was the boss's daughter. Catherine's area of expertise, foreign aid, and the countries involved, and that's a great many, but in particular the Pacific Islands, and specifically the Solomon Islands and Timor Leste, are right in the news now. We didn't know that a year ago, so it's very, very interesting for Catherine to be able to talk about those areas. In the Solomon Islands, I think Catherine was there for 2 years, lived there. She was the development coordinator with the Regional Assistance Mission, Ramsey, and Timor-Leste. Catherine was there too when that sort of dastardly bastardry happened. Absolutely no involvement, of course. And Catherine's talk, though, will focus on the importance of foreign aid, not those sort of press tidbits. And I hope along the way we'll learn how a young, talented girl, not quite sure of her career direction, ended up as Australian AIDS Deputy Director of Global Programs, based in Canberra but working internationally, often in very poor and confronting situations. Before retiring from the department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in May 2014, Catherine led the AID's programs, policy and program work in very fragile and conflict-affected environments, and also had a role to play, big role, in the humanitarian and emergency response, including disaster risk reduction and preparedness programs. She worked closely with whole-of-government partners in the planning and management of complex crises responses, especially in civil-military cooperation. So, for her extraordinary service, specifically her work in development and humanitarian assistance, Catherine was awarded the Public Service Medal in 2011, and they don't give them out willy-nilly. And you may have noticed at the beginning, next to Catherine's name was the PSM, the title. Now retired, Catherine lives in Tasmania once again, and among many other interests and roles, is Deputy Chair of the National Trust Tasmania. So thank you, Catherine. We look forward to your talk.
I think we've seen enough of Jimmy Rasta just for the moment. Thank you very much, Jill, for that kind introduction, and I'm very pleased to be here today to share some of my experiences. As Jill mentioned, I left the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which I'm going to refer to as DFAT from now on, in 2014, and since then I've managed the transition to a different life in Longford by doing some consulting assignments on development policy and serving on the boards of UN Women Australia, DFAT's Diplomatic Academy and the National Trust. I'm very happy to be home in Tasmania at this stage in my life. Now, as Jill and Margaret both mentioned, Pacific Island countries and especially Solomon Islands have occupied the political agenda in recent weeks. The security pact between China and Solomon Islands ignited a spark which flamed during the election campaign. And since the new government was elected, Foreign Minister Wong has been to the region on 3 occasions, and the Prime Minister was in Suva 2 weeks ago for the Pacific Islands Forum. Now, because of this heightened interest, I thought I would focus today on my experience of Solomon Islands and the region, as well as Timor, Leste and Afghanistan. But before I do that, just a brief introduction. I was born and I grew up in Launceston, and my first job was at the College of Advanced Education. Thank you to Donald Pulford. And my second was with Senator Don Grimes, formerly our family GP, who was Minister for Social Security and then Minister for Community Services in the Hawke government. I moved to Canberra and I joined the Commonwealth Department of Community Services and Health before returning to Parliament House to work for Neil Blewett, also born in Launceston, on childcare policy. It was the time of the Commonwealth's major expansion of childcare places and political debates about fee subsidies and privatisation. Dr. Blewett became the Minister for Trade and Overseas Development in 1988, and I was very interested in the aid program, the annual budget process, decisions on where aid was spent and through which channels. And when an opportunity arose, I joined ADAB, the Australian International Development Assistance Bureau, in 1992 as the Director of Public Affairs and Development Education. Now, working in Parliament House gave me invaluable experience in understanding the way Parliament works, the role of ministers and cabinet, the budget process, scrutiny of legislation and of government spending, and of course scrutiny by the media. ADAB was set up by the Whitlam government, and it followed a trend in like-minded countries for a standalone aid delivery institution. And AusAID, as it was later known and better understood, was a statutory agency within DFAT with its own Director General and Executive who reported directly to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. And for many years, the aid program received bipartisan support, and both coalition and Labor governments pursued increases to aid funding. In 2006, John Howard committed to doubling the aid program by 2010, and in the 2007 election campaign, Kevin Rudd committed to reaching the target of 0.5% of aid spending as a proportion of gross national income, or GNI, by 2015. That would have taken the aid program to about 8 million in 2015. So the aid to GNI ratio is the international measure of a country's standing as a donor, or an international measure of a country's generosity as a donor. Successive governments also conducted major independent reviews of the aid program, and there was broad consensus that the role of Australian aid is to help developing countries to reduce poverty through social and economic development, and aid also serves Australia's national interest by promoting stability and prosperity. And our peace and our security is inextricably linked to our neighbours. The aid program is also acknowledged as an expression of Australian values, our commitment to an open democratic society, as well as our humanitarian concern for others. As one of my former colleagues said, we give aid to help people whose level of poverty is inconceivable to us. Now, bipartisan support for the program changed rather dramatically in September 2013, when the incoming Prime Minister Tony Abbott decided to abolish AusAID and integrate the agency's aid management function with DFAT. So AusAID ceased to exist in November 2013, and this was a change that few had seen coming or could explain. The official explanation was to enable the closer alignment of the aid and diplomatic arms of international policy. The aid program then suffered a succession of large budget cuts and a considerable drop in our aid to GNI ratio, as well as our international reputation as a professional and influential development partner. Our aid to GNI ratio today is estimated at 0.21%, or to express it differently, we spend 21 cents in every $100 of national income, and aid is less than 1% of the federal budget. Now, we're well below the average of countries we like to compare ourselves with, who sit now at around 0.32%. So there's been a clear shift away from that bipartisan commitment to reaching 0.5%, and in the current economic climate, it's hard to see that changing. Some areas were protected, including aid to the Pacific and gender equality, but in general, the cuts were brutal and many multi-year programs were shut down, with consequences for our relationships with developing partners. Nevertheless, the annual outlay is $4 billion, and there are many competing priorities for where these funds are spent and on what. Some foreign policy analysts have argued recently that repeated cuts to the aid program since 2013 have spread it very thin, and that $4 billion is really not enough to achieve Australia's goals in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, particularly in the context of the assertiveness of China and the differing nature of strategic competition in the region. But there are two arms of aid spending to simplify. The first is humanitarian and emergency relief, and that responds to acute suffering brought about by natural disasters or conflict. And increasingly, humanitarian aid has been used to better prepare countries for disasters. And in the case of conflict, violent conflict, to support refugees and people who are displaced in their own countries before they need to flee to another country for protection. And this is the spending that most people understand and receives popular support. The second strand is development cooperation, which is that longer-term process, a partnership with developing countries to respond to their country needs, as well as the regional and global challenges that we all confront. And we've had very long-standing development partnership arrangements with countries in the Pacific, particularly PNG, which is the largest recipient of Australian aid still. Most people are very familiar with the term foreign aid, but it has become rather outdated. And the reason for this is that increasingly developed and developing countries are facing the same set of challenges. If we think about COVID-19 and other global health challenges, climate change, people movements, conflict, including domestic and family violence. And the way we respond to these problems will change the way we deliver aid to our partners. And since I left the program in 2014, the region has undergone rapid change. The threats to stability, prosperity and resilience in Asia and the Pacific have direct impacts on our national interest. So thinking about the Pacific region, it's really front and centre of Australia's strategic outlook and our foreign policy, and this is not new. Our geography is the key determinant of where our aid money is spent, and 24 of our neighbouring countries are developing countries, and no other developed country in the world has that sort of circle of developing countries around it. And we've always accepted a special responsibility for the Pacific, along with New Zealand and with France when disasters strike, and we've been the first to provide aid. There's been quite a lot of recent criticism that Australia has neglected the Pacific, and I think some of this is justified, but certainly not all. Nevertheless, Australia remains the largest development partner with the region, and the region is the most aid dependent in the world. It's made up of diverse countries and cultures, and I think too often we say the Pacific, but actually the countries of the Pacific Islands are really very different. You've got PNG with a population of 9 million, and Niue, a tiny island of 1,600 people, with a larger population in New Zealand than on its own territory. And the size and the breadth of the Pacific creates some really fundamental development challenges. All the countries are vulnerable to climate change and to other natural disasters, to COVID-19 and to economic shocks. Domestic and family violence is endemic, and women's political representation is the lowest in the world. There is currently no woman who is a member of PNG's parliament, for example. And as China becomes more assertive in pursuing its relations with Pacific Island countries, the ties that bind Australia to the region are increasingly important, and it's things like migration, education, sport, language, shared history, and now the seasonal worker programs. The Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme is a key to transforming our relations with the Pacific and Timor. Some have called it the most effective form of aid to the region in decades. And more than 25,000 workers are in Australia. They're filling employment gaps and they're sending remittances to their families. Pacific Island economies can't create enough jobs for their people. And labour mobility and enhancing migration for Pacific Islanders boosts economic integration. Australia has to date shied away from facilitating the permanent migration of Pacific peoples, who currently make up less than 1% of Australia's population. And this is in contrast to New Zealand, who has pursued a different pathway for permanent migration for Pacific Islanders, where they occupy about 8% of New Zealand's population. Providing a pathway to permanent residency for Pacific Islanders and their families will be a game changer, in my view, if we get it right. Now, I want to talk about the Solomon Islands. It extends over nearly 1,000 islands, but there are 9 main groups, and the population is predominantly Melanesian, but there are Polynesian, Micronesian and Chinese communities. The island groups have very distinct characteristics, and the concept of national identity is weak. Most Solomon Islanders are bonded to their wontok or their clan, not to the state. I did, however, witness an extraordinary outpouring of national pride Soccer is one of the few activities which brings young men together from different island groups. And in 2004, the Solomon Islands team played the Socceroos in Adelaide in a World Cup qualifier. The game ended in a very surprising draw for the Socceroos, but when the players returned to Honiara, the whole country erupted in celebrations for their winning team. The cause of the ethnic violence that escalated into civil war in the late 1990s was between two islands, Malaita, the most heavily populated, and Guadalcanal, where Honiara is located. And between 1998 and 2003, the violence between the rival militias on Guadalcanal shifted from low-level conflict over land and jobs to increasing lawlessness and criminality in the capital, Honiara, and elsewhere. The two main groups were heavily armed and feared by Solomon Islanders. I think you can get that impression from the Malaita Eagle Force leader, Jimmy Rasta. Over 200 people were killed, and there were many more subjected to violence and sexual assault, and thousands of people fled their homes. This period is known as the tensions. And as the militias gained control, law and order and the government's ability to deliver basic services, such as health and education, deteriorated. The economy was in steep decline. The police and the prison force had lost all legitimacy in the eyes of the local population. And the reason why Australia intervened in the Solomon Islands in 2003 was the prospect of state collapse and the security threat that a failed Solomon Islands could pose to Australia and the Pacific region. The Regional Assistance Mission to Solomon Islands, known as RAMSI, is generally regarded as a very successful intervention. It was a regional mission, it was led by Australia at the request of the Solomon Islands government, and it had international support. Every forum nation provided police, military and civilian personnel, and over 2,000 personnel were engaged in the early days of RAMSI. Many, Solomon Islanders were genuinely moved that other Pacific nations had come to help them out, but others were embarrassed that Solomon Islands had descended to rock bottom among its Pacific neighbours. RAMSI had a very clear mandate of restoring stability and security, supporting economic recovery and growth, and repairing and reforming government administration. So in each of these areas, large-scale programs were developed and agreed with the Solomon Islands government. So RAMSI was in many respects a unique endeavour and the most complex mission undertaken by Australia over the last 2 decades, including in Timor and Afghanistan. And when it ended in June 2017, the bill for the Australian government was in the order of $3 billion. Now, some analysts have argued that this is an astonishing investment in a country of 600,000 people, and one which doesn't engage our interests as broadly or as deeply as, say, PNG, with a population of 9 million. I was appointed as RAMSI's Development Coordinator in January 2004, some 6 months after the mission arrived, and I remained till March 2006. And I was a member of the Principals Group, which was led by a senior Australian official from DFAT and included the military and police commanders. And we were a tight-knit group. We travelled throughout the islands, meeting with provincial governments and conducting town hall-style meetings to explain what RAMSI was doing and to listen to concerns, as well as to every forum island country to brief contributing nations on RAMSI's progress. Now, I was sat over 2 programs, the RAMSI Development Program and Australia's bilateral program, which was run by a High Commission. But under the RAMSI umbrella, I was responsible for about 140 civilians at its peak. And they included prison officers, prosecutors, defenders, magistrates and judges to sort out the criminal justice system. Australian government public servants from Treasury and Finance were embedded in the government departments to stabilise government finances and to reinstate revenue collection. and other basic public financial management, all of which are broken down, and governance advisors to support the strengthening of the Parliament, of the Cabinet Secretariat, of the Auditor-General's Office, the Public Service and provincial governments. Now, Ramsay made really early gains in restoring law and order and removed and destroyed almost 4,000 firearms, which you saw the burning of in the first slide. And not a single shot was fired in anger in the first 12 months of the mission. The second phase of the mission to shift to building the capacity of the Solomon Islands government was, I think, more challenging than the first phase, when there was overwhelming community support for the rapid improvements in law and order and the economy and the functioning of government. Now, I learned more about prisons than I ever expected. An early priority for Ramsay was to complete a high security prison in Honiara that had been started by Japan and of course was never intended to be a high security prison. But Ramsay needed a secure place to hold the militia leaders and other criminals. Unfortunately, we had a major riot in the prison which destroyed a lot of the newly completed infrastructure, and it was only brought under control by the AFP in full riot gear, which I'd have to say is quite frightening and would certainly have frightened Solomon Islanders, who would have never seen anything like that level of force. We were also engaged in designing and building a prison in Malaita, as well as improving the existing prison in Western Province, in Gizo, the capital. It's unusual for the AID program to be so engaged in prisons, but essential to the success of the mission. And at its peak, we had some 50 prison officers from Australia working to rebuild the prison service as well as to maintain security. And for many months, the ADF had to guard the perimeter of the prison in Honiara because a breakout from the prison was considered amongst the highest risks for the Ramsay mission overall. And the scrutiny from international bodies meant that we also had to prioritise accommodation for juveniles and for women. Now, the weather coast of Guadalcanal is aptly named. It sits on one side of Guadalcanal. There's a mountain range in the middle, and then Honiara and the biggest population on the other side of the island. And because it had harboured so many of the militia members, the Ramsay principals used to visit there quite frequently to take the temperature of reconciliation and of community wellbeing, and we always travelled by helicopter. The visibility was often a problem. On one visit, on our way home, we were already taking the very long way around the coast of Guadalcanal rather than to go over the mountain range, but even in those conditions, the pilot decided we had to put down. So he found a little patch of beach, and it was only a narrow strip, and we descended there and waited for better weather. But some minutes later, a man popped up out of the water, about waist height, with black goggles on, and then a few minutes later, 10 others did as well. It was quite bizarre. It was like something out of a film set, I think, and I'm not sure who was more surprised, they that we were sitting in this little helicopter on their beach, or we that they'd popped up out of the ocean. Anyway, I think they resumed their fishing after we'd taken off. And on another trip to the Weather Coast, I was told about a village very far inland called Tasmania. And the only information I could find was that it may have been named after a missionary who lived there in the 1970s and 80s, but I've never been able to confirm that. Australia also funded community projects across the islands to improve services and to give people a visible peace dividend. And at the Burrow and Arbour Health Clinic, which I opened with the Deputy High Commissioner, that was quite some ceremony. We arrived in a banana boat, and as we pulled up on the sand, 10 fierce warriors leapt out of the trees around us with their spears. And when they had scared us enough, they escorted us into to the new health clinic, And that is the traditional form of welcome. I mean, they have to first find out whether you're coming in peace. And we certainly were on that occasion. At the end of the ceremony, also a traditional custom in Solomon Islands, I was given a rather large pig. And we had to travel back to Honiara in a banana boat with a trussed pig. It wasn't a comfortable experience, and when we arrived, the office staff assured me that they would be able to deal with the pig. I'm sure they enjoyed it very much. When Ramsay withdrew in June 2017, there were a lot of Solomon Islanders who were worried about the future of their country because they thought that the underlying cause of the tensions was still there and that some of the key players were still influential in government and in the private sector. But Ramsay was never designed to be a permanent presence, and the length of time it remained in the Solomon Islands, I think, does underline the need for interventions of this kind to stay the course, in contrast to Timor. And Australian ministers understood this. I mean, Alexander Dana, who was minister at the time, certainly understood it, that there wasn't going to be a short-term fix for intractable problems of geography and intra-island rivalry and poor human resource capacity and corruption and weak governance. But an important confidence measure in 2017 for Solomon Islands was the security agreement that was signed with Australia to provide that over-the-horizon guarantee that Australian Defence Police and civilian personnel could be rapidly deployed in emergency situations, either to provide security and or humanitarian aid. And this was activated late last year when riots broke out in Honiara. But quite how it would function with the China-Solomon Islands Security Pact, if it were invoked, is an unknown. So another state-building exercise took me to Timor, Leste, in February 2000 after a 3-year posting in Rome, where I'd represented Australia on the executive board of the World Food Programme. And Timor, as many of you will know, descended into violence and chaos following the popular ballot for independence in 1999. There were similarities with the Solomon Islands. Civil conflict, weak service delivery, high youth unemployment and a low skills base. But neither country is close to international trade routes, and both suffer from the high cost of international and domestic transport, and each has tourism potential, but the internal infrastructure to support visitors once they arrive is very poor. And both have finite industries which are open to exploitation and have indeed been exploited in the case of Solomon Islands, and poor management. So after only a few weeks' turnaround in Tasmania, I landed in Dili on a military transport plane at about 9 p.m. on Valentine's Day. I remember it very well. And my accommodation was a floating boat used for oil rig workers. And to my surprise and to hers, I shared a cabin with an Australian volunteer, almost the size of a berth on the Spirit of Tasmania, and our suitcases took up the last bit of floor space between the beds. But she'd added her own touches to the room, which included a bar fridge and a lava light. So when I woke up the next day, it was absolutely a revelation. The scale of destruction in Dili was enormous. Burnt out remains of homes and prominent buildings, and of course beyond Dili, schools, clinics, houses, churches and other community buildings had also been torched by the departing Indonesian forces, and much worse was to come as the scale of militia-led killings of innocent civilians became known. My office was in the Portuguese government palace on the Esplanade. It was a big, white, imposing building, and it had been left unscathed, possibly because it had been the Portuguese governor's office. It was the obvious headquarters for UNTAED, the United Nations Transitional Administration in East Timor. And I had one staff member on day one, a German national, who tried to secure some office furniture and computers, and she was also helpful about accommodation. One, that I was entitled to a room of my own, and two, that I should try to get off the boat as soon as possible. And several weeks later, I moved to the Hotel Resende, where senior UN officials were living. It was across the road from the Governor's Palace and secure, and I lived there for 18 months. No hot water or television, but a fridge and air conditioning. Not quite the best exotic Marigold hotel, but still with plenty of quirks. And actually, it subsequently burnt down in riots in Dili. So Timor attracted huge international attention and support, and funding flowed for the immediate humanitarian crisis, which was quite difficult, both in terms of logistics, because Timorese people had fled to the mountains to very inaccessible areas, and they were in desperate need of food and medical assistance. And also there was a coordination challenge between the civil players, the very large numbers of NGOs who were present in Timor at the time, and the military contingent, including INTERFET, which was led by General Cosgrove. And there were still security concerns because the Timorese Resistance Army had been accommodated and kind of held within one area of the country until the negotiations could be completed about their demobilisation. And as I said, there were numbers of international NGOs, the UN agencies, other international organisations, and they were all competing for living quarters, for office space, for the best and brightest Timorese staff, and anyone who could speak English was in very high demand. Alongside the crisis response, there was major exercise to plan the recovery and rebuilding of Timor, and the idea was to have a seamless transition between the two, and that largely worked. As the Chief of Donor Coordination and the Special Representative of the Secretary-General's Office, I led a small multinational team to engage with donors and the Timorese leadership on priorities for funding and to try to avoid duplication and overlap. And it was a difficult task, given the scale of the destruction and the lack of Timorese capacity. There were priorities everywhere. And the donor environment was quite crowded and complex as well. Competition to be, lead donor in a sector or to provide a so-called signature project was intense, despite the best efforts of the World Bank and the UN working together to coordinate the overall donor effort. And we worked really hard at it. We worked 6 days a week, long hours, and our powers of persuasion were tested, especially when we tried to seek support for Timor's recurrent budget rather than a donor's pet project. Now, aside from the obvious connection to Timor, proximity in the case of Australia and colonial history, solidarity in the case of Portugal, Timor was supported by the international community because of the efforts of José Ramos Horta, newly elected president, again, who travelled tirelessly to advocate for independence along with other key figures in the diaspora. And there's no doubt that Xanana Gusmao, the resistance leader, was an immensely charismatic figure who inspired world leaders as well as his own people. Timor was swamped with high-level visits. The UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan at the time, President of the World Bank, Jim Wolfensohn, President Wahid of Indonesia, Prime Minister John Howard, Prime Ministers of Portugal, Brazil, Japan, foreign and development ministers from various countries. And they came because they wanted to support Timor and because the UN mission there was the largest and most comprehensive state-building exercise the UN had ever been engaged in. And the task was really to rebuild every function of government, from Treasury, finance, immigration, health, education and infrastructure. And there were very few Timorese public servants with any managerial experience, an early impediment to handing over the reins of government, and some experienced Timorese expatriates returned to Timor to help, but not nearly as many as were expected and as were needed. So it became clear quite quickly that the focus of the UN mission had to shift to capacity building, for the core government functions, and that this needed to be achieved in a shorter time frame, because this sort of state building was not universally supported by member states of the UN, those member states who were largely fitting the bill. So they were concerned that the UN was setting up a sort of open-ended commitment that would be a drain on resources. And alongside that concern, you had the frustration of Timorese leaders, many of whom had been in exile for over 25 years and were keen to take over the reins of government. So the UN's transitional administration had to shift rapidly to a model that engaged Timorese public servants mentored by UN advisors. There were difficulties. The UN mission was a multicultural melting pot. The leadership required to pull it all together and move it forward as a basis for a transitional government in a coherent way was enormous. And it was inevitable that some mission staff would seek to replicate the model of a fully functioning department from their own country. And some UN civilians who had set up departments or government functions found it really hard to step back from running the show to selecting and mentoring a Timorese head. And capacity building in this environment was hard work, and not everyone had the skills to do it well. 4 languages were spoken: Tetum, Bahasa, Portuguese and English, and the language issue was fraught. Young Timorese, anyone under 20, had grown up speaking Bahasa and Tetum, the local language, but many wanted to learn English, and the older Timorese spoke Portuguese and Tetum. For some exiled Timorese in Mozambique and Portugal, Portuguese was regarded as the language of the resistance and would distinguish Timor from Indonesia and Australia. But many young Timorese knew that learning English was the passport to the global community, to connecting with the global community. And Australia made a very generous offer to set up an English language school, which was rebuffed by the Timorese leadership. The rebuilding of the justice sector is actually an insight into how fraught the language issue was. The Timorese leadership wanted the justice sector to be operate in Portuguese. It appointed judges who first had to learn Portuguese before they learned how to become a judge. And that would have taken several years. And our efforts to coordinate resources were often undermined. For the first 12 months, there was, as I've said, an unending stream of high-level visitors and donor missions and private sector interests, and many ignored the basic truth that Timor would be a small and a poor country with a very limited recurrent budget and would not be able to fund the ongoing costs of aid projects once our donors withdrew. And after independence, the UN dramatically reduced its involvement, and that had some serious ramifications. It led to the fragility of the police force and the army, and there was a subsequent breakdown of law and order in 2006, and Australian combat troops had to go in to quell the fighting at that time. It was a really unfortunate crisis only 4 years after independence. Now, I stayed in Timor for 2.5 years, and I left in the days after spectacular Independence Day celebration attended by the UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan and former President Bill Clinton and Alexander Downer, among many other foreign dignitaries. And I do have a lasting memory of that night, the arrival of the Indonesian President Megawati Sukarno-Putri. There was speculation about whether she would attend from Jakarta, and everyone heard her plane fly low over Dili. And when she came into the arena, there was a huge cheer that reverberated around the ground. And my interpretation of that is that it was an acknowledgement of respect that their former adversary had come to celebrate the occasion. I was very fortunate to work with the Secretary-General's Special Representative, Sergio Vieira de Mello. He was a consummate Brazilian diplomat, and he skillfully brought the disparate elements of the Timorese leadership together. Tragically, he was killed in a bomb blast at the UN headquarters in Baghdad in August 2003, which killed 22 UN staff and wounded over 100. It was the first time, I think I might actually, Sergio is just there next to General Peter Cosgrove. It was the first time that the UN organisation had been targeted in such a devastating way, and at the time Sergio was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and he was widely touted as the future Secretary-General, and he was revered in Timor and by many hundreds of UN staff around the world. And I was also fortunate to work with Amelia Pires, who in 1975 had been rescued by a Norwegian captain who diverted his ship to Dili to pick up Timorese, mostly women and children, and take them to safety in Australia. She has worked all her life for Timor, and she became the Minister for Finance, and after leaving that portfolio she became an international development consultant and authority on fragile states. Now I'm conscious of the time, but I'm just going to move on to Afghanistan, because towards the end of my time in Timor, Afghanistan was sort of looming as the next big thing following the 9/11 attacks in the US. And Timor and Solomon Islands were relatively benign environments where large numbers of civilians could be engaged in the development effort, and where Australia had long-standing experience and expertise. And supporting reconstruction and development in a hazardous environment changed the way we had to think about aid. We had always taken the view that you couldn't do anything without security and stability. But AusAID was under very sustained pressure from other departments in Canberra to deliver projects in Oruzgan province, where the ADF was based at Tarankot. And the whole Afghanistan endeavour preoccupied government at the highest level and multiple departments. And there was intense oversight of everything that was done on whole of government committees, that feeding to ministers and to cabinet. The duty of care for AusAID officers and other aid workers in a war zone was a constant concern, and it weighed heavily on me. And some of you may have seen the recent ABC Australian story update about David Savage, who was severely injured in Oruzgan in a suicide bombing carried out by a 12-year-old boy. We were very fortunate not to lose any civilians in Afghanistan. We worked alongside DFAT and the AFP in Tarankot, and of course the ADF, but it was a task that stretched us on many fronts. Oruzgan, population of 1%, literacy 5%, 30% of government positions filled. AusAID staff couldn't leave the base without a full security detail, and those opportunities depended on day-to-day operations, and of course meetings could only take place with translators. And the absence of security meant that our traditional partners were absent. We were eventually able to partner with Save the Children and to focus on improving literacy and numeracy. And we tried hard in Kabul to kind of connect Oruzgan's government with the central government in basic systems, for example, paying teachers. And those sorts of systems and processes just didn't exist in Afghanistan. It's heartbreaking really to see what's happening now, and 4 decades of violence and warfare have left some 24 million people on the brink of starvation, and that's almost 12 months after the Taliban took over. And Afghanistan remains one of the worst countries in which to be born. There's a lot more that I could talk about, but I just want to conclude with just a couple of reflections. I always wanted to join the public service, and I feel very lucky to have worked on some challenging policy and program issues with really clever and inspiring people. And I've met some extraordinary people around the globe, and I've been in the background of high-level meetings on some of the bigger, crises of the last decade or so. And ultimately, there's the satisfaction in knowing that aid programs can change people's lives. people living in unimaginable poverty for whom a small loan through a microcredit scheme means they can send their children to school, or people who've lost everything in a natural disaster or who've fled from violence, receiving protection and some help to start again. I was often impressed by the quiet dignity of people with very little, especially women who care for their children, grow food, carry water, wait in endless queues for help and eat last. Now, I want to be optimistic about the future for these women, but it's hard sometimes. There are women dying needlessly in childbirth in Timor and PNG, very close to our shores, because they can't get to medical help. And in Afghanistan, women and girls no longer have the joy of education or the expectation of equality. So we are a wealthy country. Perhaps it doesn't feel that way at the moment, but we can and should do more individually through NGOs and through our Australian government's aid program to make the world we live in a better place, more secure and more stable for future generations. We must lift our ambition beyond our shores and carry our values of freedom and compassion to our near neighbours and beyond. Thank you.
Don't move yet, Catherine. We do have a little time, so if there are questions from the floor, we would have time probably for a couple of questions. Anyone like to question or comment?
Thanks for a very enlightening address. What do you think is the future for parliamentary democracy in the Solomons?
The future for?
Parliamentary democracy in the Solomons.
That's a very difficult question. There are some very good people in the Solomon Islands Parliament, but unfortunately some excellent people over the time that I was in Solomon Islands are no longer with us. I think really the good people have to stand up and are trying to do that. The whole relationship, the switch of the relationship from Taiwan to China was not universally supported in the Parliament, and I think is going to add to the tensions that are already exist. The other thing I'd say about leadership in the Pacific Island countries and Timor is that it has a feeling of being recycled. Prime Minister Sogavare was Prime Minister in the 1990s, and he's come back, and the same, interestingly, the same sort of 4 or 5 key people in Timor are still in, President, Prime Minister, and so on today. So look, I put my faith in a small group of younger leaders who are really going to try and step up, and I think our job is going to be to support them in the best way we can. Yeah. I remain optimistic. Yeah. Yeah.
Catherine, that was really inspiring, and inspiring from multiple levels, reminding us of our responsibility as a wealthy nation. I think sometimes we look inward rather than looking outward, and looking at just how lucky we are in this vast nation and what a responsibility we have. You reminded us of that. I picked up on some certain key elements in your wonderful, inspiring journey, because it is inspiring that we can make a difference. And one was to remind us what poverty really means. And I don't think in Australia we really understand that very well. Listening and respect. You can't understand complexity unless you have a capacity to suspend your own beliefs and listen. Catherine, you showed that, and you do show that remarkably. and insightfully and very intelligently. Complexity of cultural differences in the geopolitical scene. Listening comes into that understanding of complexity. Enormous patience and not trying to drive an agenda too quickly. Capacity building does rely on education. That power of education is so important, isn't it? And I think you reminded us of that, even when you're talking and refer to the recycling element. Where's the education of the younger generation? And not just bringing in the diaspora from afar, but within the community itself. Catherine, as a member of the diaspora who has returned to Tasmania, we are just so lucky, aren't we, that this island has produced such remarkable people in the world who are making such a big difference. We're even luckier that you returned to Tasmania. So thank you very much. And a little Now, just before we disperse, a little promo for next month. Jill and I have been gathering our resources together, and we continue to look to our special people in the community to tell their stories, and our speaker next month is Tony Walker. Unlike Catherine, who has returned to the island, Tony is someone who has made the island home, and I kind of think we can almost consider him a Tasmanian. He arrived here with his wife Sue in 1973. Probably not quite long enough. Nevertheless, his contribution to Tasmanian life has been considerable. Some will remember the Lalla market. Do you remember the Lalla market? Well, Tony was instrumental in getting that up and going. He also wrote a column in the Examiner for a long period of time on wine. Wine is one of his areas of expertise. And he's actually written and authored books on wine. So we have a lot to look forward to next month, and I hope that you'll join us again then. So thank you very much for coming today.